Okay. So today's daf is Chav Beis. We're going to do a quick chazor of Chav Aleph. First, the Gemara was discussing whether or not a woman who owns the tablet upon which the get was written, does she have a sophistication to understand that she has to be totally maknit to her husband, and then he's going to give it back. Then the next shiloh that we had was the halacha of someone writes a get and puts it into the hand of his eved, and then he gives the eved to the lady. The halacha is she's going to be koinah. We said she'll only be koinah if the eved was tied down, so it wouldn't be considered a chatzar malaches. The Gemara said the same thing would apply if he put a get into his chatzar and then he was makna the chatzar to his wife. Where it would not apply is if he put his get into his friend's chatzar and then his friend was makna the chatzar to the wife. That wouldn't work because that's not a proper benosan from the husband to the wife. Gemara then probed a little bit into where do we know that a chatzar could be koinah. The Gemara says it's only because of yad. So the Gemara had a problem. Yad has to work bal karcha. A chatzar wouldn't work bal karcha. So the Gemara didn't answer that question. But the Gemara did discuss shlichos. A shlich like Kabbalah works even though it can't be done bal karcha. The Gemara said it's possible that the makor for shlichus is not because of yada. It's possible because we dash in the pasuk v'shilchat mi beisai. The way it's written with a mapakeh means he will send her away from her house. But we darshan as if there's no mapakeh v'shilchat mi beisai that a woman can make a shliach for gershon. But if there's a pasuk that tells us that a woman can make a shlich like Kabbalah, then it doesn't have to conform to the way yad works. Then the Gemara asked, we know that a get could be written on the horn of an animal or on the hand of an eved. We understand why you wouldn't cut off the hand of an eved just to give the get portion. But why not just cut off the keren of the paro? Give it back. So the Gemara answered with an extremely important halacha that's going to be relevant today. It says, B'chasa v'nosan law, meaning there could be no step required between the ksiva and the nesina. Mishaini mechusar l'ksiva u'nesina, yotzazeh shemechusar ksiva ketzitza u'nesina. If you cut off the horn, well, then there's a major process, major part of the process, major component of the process that has to occur between the ksiva and the nesina, which is the ketzitza. And therefore, it wouldn't work because it says v'chasa v'nosan, so that's why you have to give the entire animal. It's not by any mitzvah. It's because of the v'chas and v'nosan. There's a special pasuk to tell us dafka by get that has to be this way. Anywhere else it doesn't have to be this way. And then we had a machlekes Tosfos and the Rishonim. What happens if you have a long roll of paper and you write a get and then you just cut it off? Would that be good? Tosfos says it would not be good, and others say no. It's only by balei chayim where there's a problem of cutting something off. But if it was just a paper, it wouldn't be a problem. Tosfos says it is a problem. However, Tosfos does agree that if you're just trimming the edges, that wouldn't be a problem. But if it's mamish part of a roll and you're cutting it off, Tosfos says that will be a problem. I want to highlight that machlokes because we're going to learn a Rashi today that will reveal to us what Rashi's opinion is. So the question is, if I write a get on a roll and I cut it off, it's not a balchai, is that a problem or not? Tosfos holds it is, other Rishonim hold it's not. Today we're going to discover what Rashi holds. Okay, then Rabbi Yosy clearly told us that you cannot write a get on a balchai or on oichel or on food. And he learned it because of the two words in the pasuk that are somewhat contradictory. The Chazal law is very broad. Sefer is very limited. So we learn that you can write a get on anything as long as it shares two similarities with Sefer. A is it can't be a davar sheish b'rechaim, and B is it cannot be an oichel. The Rabbanan use these sukim for avidrashas. For instance, the Chazal law, he learns that gerushin could only occur with a get; it can't occur with the other methods of kedushin. There would be a havamina that, however, you could do kedushin, you could do gerushin, such as gerushin with kesef. Haret mugaresh libet habasuk dash moshe v'Yisrael. The pasuk of the Chazal law tells us that only ksiva works for gerushin. That's not. That's why the discussion is around the kesef. Are you saying good? it lends new meaning to the word that he screwed him up. Right? Zakt Gemara weiter. The other limud that we learned is from Karsa is that a get has to be a complete severance, a complete krisos, meaning that if there's a tanai that's still joining them, for instance, he makes the get contingent on the time that you won't drink wine, that's not a proper krisos, and that would not be a get at all. Okay, Gavaldik. And now we are up to the next Mishnah, which we also learned. We learned the Mishnah says ein koifin b'mechuber lakarka, and then it says koifin b'mechuber tolshe v'chos b'v'nos l'kosher. So right away the Gemara asks, if you can't write it the mechuber, so how could the Mishnah say a second later if you wrote it would be kosher? So the Gemara had two approaches. Either it's going according to Rabbi Eliezer, who holds Edim Mesira Karsi, which means that when it says v'chos avla in the pasuk, it means the ksiva of the get has to be written l'shma, and the ksiva of the get has to be written b'tolish. However, that's only the main component of the get, not all of the nusach. And in a get, there's two components. There's the typhus, which is the long text, and then there's the tarif, which has the most important parts. That we say in Koshim b'chub l'karka. If you wrote the tarif b'chub l'karka, then the get is possible even b'di'evet. Ein Koshim b'chub l'karka is saying don't even write the typhus of the get b'mechuber. Why? Because we're afraid if you write the typhus b'mechuber, you might by mistake also write the tarif b'mechuber. Right. So Rabbi Elazar Dashan's ksiva is the ksiva. Rabbi Meir Dashan's ksiva means the chesima, and that will be mentioned beferish in the Gemara tomorrow. We also had it in Rashi at the beginning of the Masechta on Gimel and Vei. So let's see what it says. So the one way to learn the Mishnah is ein koshim b'mechuber l'karka lechatchila. Don't even write the typhus on mechuber. Kasvei b'mechuber, but if you wrote the typhus on the mechuber, but not the tarif on the mechuber, and talshoy v'chasmay v'nosnula, and then you retilish it. And the chasmay means you did the tarif, and you did the tarif because there's no chasima required according to Rabbi Elazar. But chasmay means you sealed the get, meaning you wrote the tarif because not kosher b'di'evet. But the chetchila, you should even write the typhus, the talish, and if you wrote the tarif b'mechuber, it will be possible even b'di'evet. That's using the mahalach of Elazar. But the Shlokas also said we can use the mahalach of Rabbi Meir. And ein koshim b'mechuber l'karka mean don't even write the tarif b'mechuber. Don't write the tarif b'mechuber l'karka l'chatchila. Why? Because we're afraid if you write the tarif b'mechuber, you might also by mistake get the edim to sign b'mechuber. Kasvei b'mechuber, but b'di'evet if you wrote even the tarif b'mechuber, but talshoy v'chasmay v'nosnula. But before the chesima you were tolish it b'di'evet it will be kosher. Rabbi Yehuda Paisel achetei kesivasoi v'chasimasoi b'tolish. We don't. Everything has to be b'tolish. You cannot write on any type of paper that does not have security features in it. If the Chacham don't care about security features, we'll need to understand why, which we will learn today. So we are up to, I already went through the Gemara from after the Mishnah till the dot that's on the third line from the bottom. So we're at the third line from the bottom on the Chof Aleph, Amud Aleph, base. The third line from the bottom of the Chof Aleph and base, second last word on the line, Kasvay al Cheres Filachus Nak. So this is an important Gemara because we had a story all the way at the beginning of the Masechta about a ship that had produce growing in it that was rubbing against the bottom of the sea. And we said that produce is considered produce of Eretz Yisrael because we say it's connected, it's yonik from the ground. Rashi told us that the ship was made out of cheres. It was a ship made out of cheres, and therefore, even though it didn't have a hole in it, it still absorbs from the ground. But had the ship been made out of wood, wood would not allow any nutrients to come up from the ground, and wood only works if it has a hole in it. So all over Shas, when you learn about an otzitz nokuv, it's referring to a wooden otzitz nokuv. Because if it was cheretz otzitz, it would be fine even if it wasn't nokuv, it would be yonik from the ground. That's how Rashi learned. Tosfos asked a kasha from this Gemara that we're about to learn. Tosfos tells Rashi, if you're saying that by a klicheret, it's yonik from the ground, even though it's not nokuv, how are you going to understand the next line that we're about to learn here in the Gemara? Kos v'al cheres shall otutz nokiv kosher. If you wrote it on the cherev of otutz nokiv, it's kosher. Why? Aish mechuber lekarka. Teretz is the shakal levi yoyv leneheli, because you don't have to cut anything. It's not a chasor of mechuber lekarka. The psul by get is mechuber lekarka. The psul is it's mechusar ktitza. This is not mechusar ktitza. You just hand the whole flower pot over. But the fact that the Gemara says that the cheres had to be shalotus nokiv, it could have said kosvay al cheres regular without nokiv. According to Rashi, you would have the same halacha, because Rashi holds that cheres is porous. So that's what Tosfos Kasha was. You have a raya from here that the cheres needs a hole in it, and the ship that we're talking about that absorbs without a hole, that's a wooden ship. So it's actually machlokes between Rashi and Tosfos. Tosfos holds the wooden ship is more porous, and Rashi holds the cheres ship is more porous. Kabaltic. So the shak of Levi Yoivne Lahela. So this is a very, very important, halacha. And let's see Rashi. The shak of Levi Kulei Otzitz, you just take the whole Otzitz. The Ein Kan Mechusik Tzitza, because you don't have to cut anything. The Ein Lochos Shema Yishbar Acheres, V'yitin Lachaticha. In fact, Rashi, we have to be concerned that if you let him give the Otzitz Nakav with the get written on it to the woman, maybe he'll cut out the section of the Otzitz that has the get on it. The Havalak Tzitza, and it will be Katzitza. Now, clearly, you see from Rashi here that there's a concern of Katzitza even on a davar that's not a Bachai. Because an Otzitz is just a clay jug. And we're saying it would be possible if he wrote the get on the clay jug and then cut out the square that the get was written. Rashi says it will be possible. Rashi says you don't have to be choshed to do that. Yes, I hate my wife and I don't want to give her a good otzitz, but I'm still not going to mess up the otzitz. I'm going to give her the get. I'm going to give her the otzitz intact. You're trying to passel the get? What are you trying to do? Yeah. The otzitz is not yonik from the ground. The plant is yonik from the ground. The otzitz is just a keli that's holding. Okay, so at least we have now a Rashi from Rashi that he holds that even if it's not a balchai, there's still a problem with ktitza. And as a matter of fact, Rashi, the whole problem is ktitza. So if I had a hechetimtza of a mechubel karka that didn't need ktitza, like this plant growing into Atatokov, it would be just fine. Interesting enough that where else is it noigeya? Atatz nakav is yearning for the karka. Lean Shabbos. Lean Shabbos, if you picked it up and moved it away, that would be considered a kaitzer. It would be the mocha deraisa. And if it was an atatz over Eretz Yisrael, the pears growing there would be chayv midaraita on Trumas HaMaisos. So you see that not all atatz nakavs are created equal. When it's lagabe gershon, where the twist isn't the problem of mechubel karka. Mechubel karka, the twist is that you can't have an extra action that has to occur in between the ksiva and the sina. Even though it's mechubel karka, it would not be a problem. I'm sorry? Correct. But the parameters are slightly different. Okay, what about Allah shalatzitz nafim? The otzitz was never mechubel karka, but the leaf is mechubel karka. But you also don't need to make a ma'aseh tzitza. So you give the whole plant. So the question is, would that be a kosher again? Zok Gemara Abayam or kosher? It is a bachai. I mean, it's a plant. What's the problem? We'll see in a second. I'm happy you're bringing that up. Is it a problem in Neubeit that's a bachai, or is it a problem in my cut? Abaya Amar kosher, but Rav Amar posel. So according to Rabbi Yosy, clearly it probably wouldn't work. I don't know if a plant is a bachai. Plant's not a bachai, so it probably wouldn't be an issue anyway. So Abaya Amar kosher, which needs explanation because it's a mechubel karka, but Rav Amar posel. Abaya Amar kosher. Because once again, the same story we said, even though it's mechubel karka, but you don't need to do anything. The shakalei v'yoyvel nehela. Rashi says the shakalei la'otzis v'yavna. They give it the whole thing. So therefore, there's no concern that there will be an action in between that will possible to get. Rav Amar apostle gzeira shema yiktaim. We're afraid that you're going to end up cutting the leaf that has the text of the get written on it. So by the otzitz, Rashi says we're not worried he'll cut out that part because you're going to ruin the otzitz, but cutting off the leaf doesn't ruin anything, so we're afraid he'll do that, and therefore it's not allowed as a get. So you see clearly the parameters is not mechuber or not mechuber. The parameters is if there's going to be a katzitza in between the ksiva and the nesina. And now we have another very interesting case. Otich shal echad uzroim shal echad. there are two friends. One owns a flower pot, and his friend, so let's say Reuben owns a flower pot, and Shimon planted a plant in Reuben's flower pot. So the flower belongs to Shimon, and the pot belongs to Reuben. What happens if Mocher Bala Otitz Lebal's Roim? What if Reuben, who owned the flower pot, wanted to sell the flower pot to Shimon, who owns the plant that's in the pot? So how would Shimon be kind of the flower pot? The flower pot we know is metaltlin. How are you kind of metaltlin? Even Shemashach Kana. The moment he makes a Mashicha on the flower pot, he's kind of the flower pot. The plant he already owns. But the flower pot, you make Mashicha. It's not Mechubal Karka. A flower pot is not Mechubal Karka. It's not Mechubal. The plant might be Mechubal Karka, but the flower pot is not. Flower pot is not part of the plant. So you could do Mashicha and you'll be kind of. Now, of course, you could do Kinyan Kesef as well, but we're not talking about Kesef. What about the other way? What if Shimon wanted to sell his plant to Reuben? How will Reuben be kind of the plant? Mocher Bal's Roim Lebal Otzitz. There it's Loikana Chiyachtik Bizroim, exactly because Moshe Stern said that that's considered Mechubal Karka. You cannot be kind of Mechubal Karka with Kinyan Mashicha. Kinyan Mashicha is only a Kinyan that's designed for Metaltlin. To be kind of Karka, you need to make a Chazaka or maybe a star, but you need to make a Chazaka. So until he makes a Chazaka on the Zroim, he won't be kind. What is an example of a Chazaka? It's an action that manifests your ownership. So you prune it a little bit, you fix it a little bit, or if it's a real property, you'd fix the gate. So that's how it would work. So I want to stop here for a second. From our Mishnah, from our Gemara, or the Brisa that we just learned, it's mashma that you cannot koina karka with Mashicha, right? Because it says you need to be Yachzik Bizroim, right? Now, what if I would argue maybe the reason why karka is not nicked to Mashicha, which is what you said a minute ago, is because you can't make Mashicha on karka. But maybe if it's a karka that I could make Mashicha on, such as this plant, maybe I would be able to be kohen. You have arrived from this Gemara that it's not because it's impossible to do, it's a rule. Karka, something that has a halachic status of karka, you cannot be kohen the Mashicha. So based on that, let me ask you what you would say by an Eved. An Eved is considered kakarkadam, right? So would you be able to be kohen an Eved with Mashicha? Correct. But would you be able to be kohen an Eved with Mashicha? What do you think? Mashiach, you should pull him. Would it work? But didn't we just say that if it's karka, you cannot be kohen with Mashiach? The same way you can't be kohen a plant with Mashiach. Why would you be able to be kohen an Eved with Mashiach? No, let's say the Mashiach was a Mashiach. You're pulling him. You're pulling it. You don't have to buy an animal. You can make Mashiach. You don't say Chayno says that's why you pull an animal. So how can you pull the Eved and be kohen with Mashiach? What's the difference? You can still do Mashiach. So are you saying you could be kohen Mashiach or not? I mean, why are you delving into that? Let's focus on this question that Mashiach, we see from our Gemara that Kinyan Mashiach does not work on something that has a halachic status of karka. It's not a full status of karka. That's why. How do you know it works? You're making an assumption. Pashas, it shouldn't work. Pashas, it shouldn't work. So the Ramah rather says that it works, and everyone freaks out. How do you understand this? So the Nesivos HaMishpat says a huge chiddush, and says that when we say something is kemakarki dami, it's not an absolute. So even though we said everything is kemakarki dami, that's lagabe a lot of halachas. But lemaisa, you could still make a kinyan on it. Masha enkein, this plant that's growing in the Atzut Nagov, that has a mamash din of karka. And therefore, you won't be able to make a Mashiach on it. So this is actually one of the kashas that the Nesivos asked, why is it that an Eved you could make Mashiach on, even though it's Kamak Karka, and the plant grow in an Atzut Nagov, you cannot make Mashiach on? And the answer is because the Abdu Kamak Karka Dam is Nesivos is not an absolute. It's only Lagabi certain halachas, but clearly not Lagabi the Kinyan Mashiach. Zok Gemara Vayter, another interesting case. What if you own a flower in a flower pot? And you sold me your flower pot with your flower, like we typically buy things. The halach is, if I made a kinyan chazaka on the plant, automatically. I made no kinyan on the otzitz because of kinyan agav. The zui sheshaninu. No, not because it's part of our. The zui sheshaninu nechasim she'ein laham achrayis niknin im nechasim she'esh laham achrayis v'chesef uv'shtaru v'chazaka. If I have a bicycle in Taiwan and a piece of property in Toronto, and I buy a piece of property from you in Toronto, and you have a bicycle in Taiwan, I could automatically be counted as a bicycle in Taiwan because of kinyan agav. Even if they have nothing to do with each other. And that's the chiddush of kinyan agav. So you're making a kinyan on the karka, and agav the karka, you're being kind of the metaltlin. There's a lot of alumnus on how this works. There's a shaila, does it work because if you're doing a kinyan karka, you don't need a kinyan on the metaltlin, you're automatically kind of, or do we say the kinyan on the karka, it's as if there was a kinyan done on the metaltlin. And there's a similar such shaila that you would appreciate. And that is, when there's an ikr and a tafel by an oichel, you make a bracha on the ikr, you don't make a bracha on the tafel, right? If you're eating cornflakes and milk, I mean, there maybe the bracha shakal. If you're eating a mezonius cereal, milk, right? So do you make a bracha on the mezonius in the shayla? If the ikr is the herring, right? So what is the halacha? Why don't you make a bracha on the tafel? Is it because the bracha on the ikr is like a bracha on the tafel, or pshat is if it's tafel, it doesn't need a bracha? That was the shayla, and there's nafkaminas. So you would have the same shaila by kinyan agav here. Now, Tosfos brings up another point. There's also a difference. There could be a difference to halacha if the thing if the metalton that you want to buy is actually in the same property that you're buying, or if it's elsewhere. So let's have a look in Tosfos. Tosfos brings up another point. The fourth line on Tosfos, or the last wide line. Normally, when you have kinyan agav, you have to say, "I'm being kind of a karka from you," and or be the moicher say, "I'm being makta my karka to you," and the agav the karka, "I'm being makta to you my bicycle." Here, when it's in an otzitz over here, would it require that special amira or not? And Tosfos brings up your svar exactly. Oy shema loy tzarich, hacha loy tzarich. You know why? The kivin the tzarich otzitz lezroim batal agav zroim. You cannot contain this roim without the otzitz there. So they're much more connected to each other, and therefore could be the kinyan agav works more smoothly without even saying bikoiner. You don't have to say agav ukni. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because the fact is you need that planter to move it around. So therefore, you should. Tosfos says you wouldn't necessarily have to say agav ukni because the planter is much more connected to the karka, meaning your plant, than your bicycle in Taiwan would be connected to your property in Toronto. We wouldn't make a difference. No, there's no such thing as agav. The agav is the holder agav the plant. The plant is the karka. So what if you made a chazaka on the otzitz? Meaning you didn't make a mashicha. You made a kinyan that's only appropriate for karka. You made it on the metaltlin of the otzitz. So you're surely not koina the plant, but af otzitz loikana. Why? Because it's not a good kinyan for the otzitz. But if you make a chazak on the zroim, then through kinyan agav, there'll be koina the otzitz as well. Now we have another interesting shayla. Nakvai ba'aretz, v'gufai b'chutzlaretz. What if I have a tree that's planted, its roots, its trunk enters the ground in Eretz Yisrael, but the trunk leans over the chutzlaretz, so all of the peiros are completely in chutzlaretz. Are they subject to trumas and maishus midaraisa or not? Abai Amar, that's right. Abai Amar basar nakvai eslim. You go basar nakav as Rashi says, because that's where the yanika comes from. Its nourishment is drawn from the ground, which is in Eretz Yisrael. Rav Amar basar noifayas linan. You go basar the branch. That's in Chutz La'aretz. Zok the Gemara. As a nagav orcha, what happens if you bring soil from Chutz La'aretz into Eretz Yisrael in a flower pot and you plant? Is that mechuyev in Trumas Hamashis? It is. Even though it's soil of Chutz La'aretz. No, even if it's outside enough. Even though it's shayla nakul, you'd have to take Trumas Maisus. It depends where it grew. No, I'm talking about if you planted it in soil. If you planted it in soil there, or there's a point at where the chiyuv comes. The chiyuv comes by beruach, so it depends on where the chiyuv is triggered. Now, let me ask you another question. The halacha is that if you have, what if I have pairs of chutz la'aretz? I bought pairs of chutz la'aretz, and I brought it into Eretz Yisrael, but I wasn't. It wasn't nigmar. It wasn't roya pnei bias. The trigger to be mechayiv when trumas and maishus did not happen. It happened in Eretz Yisrael. You have to take trumas and maishus from these pairs of chutz la'aretz, but the trigger to be mechayiv them in trumas and maishus only happened in Eretz Yisrael. The halacha is not, because it's not pairs arts. However, what if I? I'm talking about fully grown fruit, ready-made fruit, fully grown. No, it ripened to there, ripened everything in the chutz, but it wasn't ripe in the abayis, right? Until you bring it in b'derech kva, there's no chiyuv midaraisa to give trumas and maishus. But what happens if you bring in grain from chutz la'aretz? If you brought in grain from chutz la'aretz into Eretz Yisrael, you do not, no matter what, you don't have to take trumas or maishus from it, right? Because it didn't grow. But what if I brought grain from chutz la'aretz into Eretz Yisrael and they made a dough out of it? Is it mechuyev and challah? So the halacha is it's mechuyev and challah b'daraisa, because the chiyuv for challah has nothing to do with the pairs. It has to do with the arisai seichem. It's totally in when it became a dough. And therefore, it's the lisha that's mechayiv. It doesn't say anywhere in the Torah where the pairs have to come from. It just says dough in Eretz Yisrael requires a chiyuv challah. But trumas and maishus, it depends on where the fruit is grown. Correct. So Rav Amar basar noifay as linan. So we have a machloikis. Abaye says you go basar where it's nourished from the ground. Rav holds you go basar where the pears are actually found. Zok but the ashrish, the machloikis is only if the whole plant was growing in like an atzitz knuckle. Because if it was actually rooted and planted in the ground, kula amaloi pligi. There, everybody would agree that avadi go basar the roots. He pligi, the whole machloikis Abaye and Rava is b'deloi ashrish. It's speaking where it's in the nuts, not in the ground, but the roots are still in Eretz Yisrael, but they're not in the ground. There's a machlokes. Abaye says you go basar the ikar, and Rava says you go basar the knife. Correct the Gemara. I believe your assumption is wrong. I believe the machlokes applies, even if it's planted in the ground. Still, Rava would hold you go basar the knife, and you ignore the nourishment from the ground. Correct the Gemara, but the Ashish like pligi, I'll show you that they do argue. But none. What if there were two gardens? There were two next door neighbors. They had gardens next door to each other, but their elevation was different. The garden of Reuben was 10 feet higher than the garden of Shimon, which means the border between Shimon and Reuben is a wall, a big retaining wall, which is the separation between his property and Reuben's property. If you go through the wall, you're in Reuben's property. Come out of the wall, you're staring at the wall, you're in Shimon's property. The Shimon's elevation is much lower. The yerek meantime, and you have a yerek growing out of the wall. So this yerek is nourishing from the soil of Reuben, but it's technically in the airspace of Reuben. So whose vegetable is it? It belongs to the top guy, which means even if it's rooted, you go basar the rooting. Since it's in the airspace, the knife is in the tachton, you go basar the knife. So you have a machlokes tanoim even when something's rooted in the ground. If you go basar to go for the knife, right? So how could you tell me that Abaye would be moida? How can you say that Rava would be moida that you go basar the root if it was actually growing into the ground? You see a machlokes tanoim. No, that machlokes has nothing to do with the shaila of Rava and Abaye. It's a completely different set of reasoning, because Reb Meir said, you know why he's Dr. Reb Meir? You know why I hold it belongs to the Elyon? Because the Elyon can destroy this whole thing if he wants. Mami Yirtza Elyon, Lital Safra, in Kanyerik. If he decides to excavate his property and lower his elevation, the Yerik's gone. So that's why it should belong to him, because he controls it. Rabbi Yehuda, the Tachton can do the same thing. Ma'im Yirtza Tachton Lamalis is Ginot Sayofer. Vayter in Kanyerik. He can backfill his whole property and Vayter destroy the Yerik. But the machlokes is who has dominance as far as its ownership. But the shaila that we have, where it's being yoinik from one place and it's physically in another place, there, the Gemara is saying that even Rabba would agree, you go basar the Yanika. Correct? Gemara, I'll show you later there's a machlok. Vakati with the ashes like pligi. But Tanya we learned, Elon, if you had a tree, miktsase ba'aret to miktsase b'chutzlar. So you have a tree that's let's say it's rooted in Eretz Yisrael. It doesn't matter if it's rooted in Eretz Yisrael or rooted, we don't care. But physically, half of it is in Eretz Yisrael and half of it is in Chutzlar. So the problem is we have now a tree that's mixed with a chiyuv tevel, a chiyuv trumas and maasros, midiraisa and not. So the halach is we say it's tevel v'chulin mi'urav and zebazeh. All of the pairs there are a mix. Because of that, the only type of pairs you can use to be misakin those pairs are pairs from Neubei. I can't use pairs from Chutz La'aretz because they can't be misakin pairs of Eretz Yisrael. And I can't use pairs of Eretz Yisrael because they cannot be misakin pairs of Chutz La'aretz. So I have to take off Trumas and Maasros from Neubei. Divrei Rebbe. Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, no, you split it up. Haggadah b'chiyev chayiv. The part of the branches that are sticking in Eretz Yisrael, those are deraisa. Haggadah b'ptur potter. My love. So let's analyze. What exactly does it mean? Half of it is in Chutz La'aretz, half is in Eretz Yisrael. It means mixes noifay b'aretz or mixes noifay b'chutz la'aretz. So we totally ignore the rooting, and we just focus on the knife. So you have a clear raya that even if it's hushrush, we ignore where it's planted, we ignore the roots, and we focus on the branches. So how can you tell me that Rav is Maida where it's planted? That's not true. In fact, Avada Rava holds that if it's planted in the ground, you go by the nourishment. So how do you have here something that's half in Israel, half in Chutz La'aretz? So Gemara, because loy, it's a mixture of shirashin baretz or mixture shirashin b'chutz la'aretz. We're talking about where the trunk of the tree is bang on centered on the border between Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz. So some of the roots are in Eretz Yisrael, some of the roots are in Chutz La'aretz. So therefore, the nourishment is one big gemishach. And everybody holds in such a case, you go basar the nourishment of the roots. How could Reb Shimon ben Gamliel say Haggadah b'chiyev chayiv, Haggadah b'tur pur? How could he say it's not a mishach? Well, my time with Reb Shimon Gamliel, Dr. Gemara, you know why? The mafsik tunna. Imagine if directly below the tree there's a big boulder. So when the roots grew out of the tree, it either grew to the right to go around the boulder or to the left. And right on the border you have this boulder. So some of the roots are clearly defined as being only in Eretz Yisrael, and some of the roots are being defined as only being in Chutz La'aretz. And therefore, the nourishment from Eretz Yisrael stays on the Eretz Yisrael side, and the nourishment on the Chutz La'aretz side stays on the Chutz La'aretz side. My time with the Rebbe. So if the nourishment is separated, why does Rebbe say it's Kulin and Tevel Murav and Zebos? Dr. Mur, the Hadar Arvi. Yes, the roots suck up the nourishment from Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz. But once it goes into the main trunk, everything gets mixed up again. So what is the machlokes? What does Reb Shimon hold? Rebbe holds that once the trunk penetrates the ground and is moving up, there the exposure to the air will mix the nutrients around, and now everything is moving. But Reb Shimon says, the nourishment stays on its side. You know, when we were in elementary school, we would dip celery into colored water, and we would see the celery, the roots draw the water up. So it would be interesting to do a test, having red water on one side and green water on the other side, and see if the tree becomes half red and half green. Yeah. If it mixes, it'll be purple. That's right. That's right. I learned that the hard way because I once bought my wife red and green carnations, and my wife told me there's no such thing. This is the preparedness for Kasma. Yeah. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira told us. In our Mishnah. Let's quickly take a look. He says that you cannot write on paper that you could be Mizayif. It has to have security features. And if you remember, one of the security features that we talked about was they would smear it with this black light type of dust called offits, and that made it so that if there's anything erased, it would be clear because you would have erased that black. And that's a great security feature. So the Gemara talks a little bit about the process of a get. So we know you could technically write a get on anything you want. However, the Shulchan Aruch brings down the Chetchila, you should write the get on klaf that would be royu to be used for Sefer Torah. Not klaf that was made specifically for Sefer Torah, because you're not allowed to divert it. That's Sefer Torah. But klaf that was prepared just like the klaf of a Sefer Torah is the best way to write a get. But we're going to soon see right now that there's other types of cloth. So Amar Abchia Bar Asi Mishmei Deula Gimel Oireis. Oireis means it's hide, not cloth. And the reason why we're calling it hide is because we're talking about 3 different stages in the production of cloth, and the 4th stage it's cloth already. So there's in the first 3 stages it still has a status of oireis. Matza, chipa, and diftera. Matza is kamashmoi, delay meliach, v'le kamich, v'le office. So now we know the 3 stages in the processing of hide is first it's salted, then it's soaked in some type of flour concoction, and then it's smeared with the offits, and that was for the security feature, as we discussed. So matzah has nothing at all. And there's actually a shaila, matzah for Pesach. Are you allowed to put salt into the recipe, into the dough? We, of course, don't. There's a shaila if there's a chash chametz, because we know melach is kareseach. So there's a shaila if you're allowed to put melach in. But they bring right from our Gemara, we're referring to the completely unprocessed klap as matzah. The loy meliach, the loy kamiach, the loy office. So the loy kamiach, I don't know, matzah has to have kemach, but the point is that we're using the word matzah to indicate there's no salt, so it's a support to say that matzah is not supposed to have salt. L'may hilchasa, l'may nafkamina, if it's a or not, it's lohitzah Shabbos. Now we know there's an isser to be mochi mishus l'shus on Shabbos, but if you have some dust in your pocket, there's no isser in that. It only is if you're holding something of significance. So when you have this or this raw hide that you haven't processed yet, what could it be used for? And once you identify what it could be used for, we could identify how much of it is critical, that it's actually of value, and that's how much you would have to carry to be oiber for itself. Their weights that they used were lead. Lead gets rubbed out, and the weight will be diminished. So what they would do is they would wrap their weights in this unprocessed hide to protect it. So therefore, the minimum size to be over for Itzah and Shabbos is a piece of hide that you would be able to wrap a small weight in. The common, how much is that? How much is the smallest weight that you would say the paper is for? It's a small shear of weight in Pumadisa. Chiva is the second level of process. It's meliach v'loy kamiach. It was already salted, but it wasn't yet floured v'loy office. What is that good for? Again, like Shabbos, it's negate Shabbos, or kedei lasos kameya, enough to make a kameya. You write kameya, I consider it an omelet, but most people say it's an amulet. But I like omelets better. So it's that size of a paper. Diftera is a hide that went through 2 of the processes, melich v'kamiach, but it's v'loy office. Why do I need to know its shear? It's like Shabbos. So you see, a get can be written even if it doesn't have a security feature, and that's what we're trying to prove. Because we quoted from Yehuda ben Beseira that you cannot write it on the diftera because it doesn't have a security feature, but the chachamim are machshir. So this supports the chachamim who hold that you can write a get on diftera even though it doesn't have the security feature. So what is the shear of a fully processed or? Tosha says it's the shear kidei lichtoi parsha ktana shebetfilin. You need big enough of a piece of cloth that you could write a parsha ktana shebetfilin. Now it's possible that the fully developed or needs a bigger piece to be over, because once it's fully developed or, it has a new function. The function is ksivas parsha shebetfilin. So therefore it might be bigger. It might take a smaller piece of unworked out or to wrap up a weight. So it's labdavka, the more it's processed, the smaller it can be. Every stage you look at what it would normally be used for. Gebalti. The Chachamim say even if it's a get that has 0 security features, meaning you show me the get 10 days later, I have no idea that this is a kosher get. Who knows if there's a t'nai in there that was erased? I will never know. It's still kosher. Correctly more, how could it be kosher? Man Chachamim, who is the Chachamim that would hold a get is kosher without any security feature? Amar Rabbi Lazar, the Amoira said that it's Rabbi Lazar the Tana who says the Amar Edom is Sirakarsi. And Rashi elaborates. Rabbi Lazar says the Amar Chasimas Haget Einam in Torah. Really, you don't need Chasimas Haget. The edim that are required for a get are the edim mesira. The inuhu of the creasers. The edim that witness the handing over of the get, they're creating the chalois. You can't say you don't need edim at all. Avada, you need edim for any type of davar shebe'erva. Yalfinon erva davar mimam. Therefore, lechashinon ledilma mezaifa. Since we're not relying on the get itself, rather we're relying on the testimony of the edim who witnessed the handing over of the get, I don't need to worry about the get itself because I'm not using it for anything. The Amran, we said earlier that Shrichil Makarya, the Edim Asira, have to read the get before it's handed over so that they can say testimony on the full thing. We know this is a get, and we know the get was handed over. And therefore, if there was any Tanai in the get that would possibly invalidate the get, the Havabatna, Inuyati, they would know. So therefore, I don't care about the validity of the get. Because the only way she can marry somebody else and get Bezdin to give her a settle that says get lost, right, is if the Edim come and testify. And they'll tell us exactly what the conditions of the get were and what not. We don't need to paper the get. Mandama Edim Asira, Iker Haba, Mandama Edim Asira Iker Kama, Haba Linasai, a woman who wants to remarry after having received the get, she'll have to take the Edim who were there and witnessed the get. She'll have to take them to Bezdin, and they will be able to testify to Bezdin that she was Mugaresha. Reb Meir, you don't need a Demasira because it's the Edim signed on the get that do everything. The problem is, if this could be forged, I could bring a get into Bezdin, say that I was Mugareshes, but there might be a Tanai in there that I didn't fulfill that they won't know about because I erased, and I'm not really Mugareshes. The man, the samach eidich chesima, if you're samach eidich chesima, then the lady doesn't need to bring edim. Isha ba linasei beget, she doesn't bring the edim who signed on the star, who can say what it said. All she has to do is, all she has to do is bring edim who recognize the signature. So there's no one here who knows what the get looked like in its original state. And we can't assume that the get now is its an original state because we have no security features. So that's why only according to Reb Meir does the get have to be written on a secure paper, not according to Rebbe Lozer. Even this that Rebbe Lozer holds, you can have a postal get, you can have a get that's written without security features. That's only if the day she got it, she took the Edim and went straight to Bezdin and they testified. Because they'll have a clear memory of any Tnoim that might have been in the get, because they just witnessed it. They just read the get an hour ago. What if she doesn't go to Bezdin to get her release 10 days later? There, the Edim might not remember every little detail that was written in the get. They'll just remember basically what it said. This line in the Gemara is very difficult to understand. What did the Edim say? Did the Edim say we saw kosher get? So your two Edim can be Neman. You don't have to second guess them, right? And if they say they don't know, then they're not Edim. So what is this Nageya? So the Mefarshim tell us, what they're saying is we remember that there was a get. We don't remember every last word that was written. We remember that there was a get. And that's where we have a concern that it wouldn't work. And therefore, Zokt Rabbi Lozer, that you can only rely on the Edim Asira the day that they signed the get, where the details of the get are still clear by them. No, they will remember, nothing to worry about. They'll be able to remember any detail of something that they witnessed. They would remember. This that Rabbi Lozer said you can rely on Edim Asira, that's only begit. Why? Because they only need to remember it for a couple of hours till they get to Bezdin to get their release. But Bishar Storis, where I need the star, I might collect in a year from now. There you cannot loy, because this a star that you're relying only on Edim Asira, it really is only good for one day. Because afterwards you're going to forget. Where do you know that a star has to be valid as a raya long term? Put the stars that it was talking about, their stars, or put the stars or the deeds, put them into a cheres so that they should be protected for the long term. So you see that in order for something to be a good star, It has to be a star that could be relied on for the long term. Therefore, you can't rely on Eid Mesira, which are only good for a day. Even stars, you're neman by Eid Mesira. You're not going to have a good raya in a week because they won't remember. And doesn't it say that you have to? Doesn't it say that it has to be able to be a good raya for many days to come? Zok Gemara, no. Maybe the pasuk was just telling Klai as a Netzah make sure your stars will be able to be valid long term, but not necessarily that the star would be possible if you couldn't use it for long term. Zok Hakol Sharon Lichtov es a get. Anybody can write a get. If you have no das, the Gemara is going to explain why. This we learned already. The woman is the one who commissions the writing of the get, and then she gives it to the husband to give back to her. And on the flip side, when the husband wants a receipt that he paid off his suba requirements, his suba obligations, he pays for the receipt that she then signs and gives back to him. The chasima is what's mekayim it, and the get is in the man's hands when the chasima occurs, and the shoiver is in the woman's hands when the chasima occurs. Shein kiyum get al b'chaisma. Right, correct. So the kima get is going on the get, and get could be a shoiver as well. Don't forget, get doesn't always mean to get isha. So the kima of the shoiver is also with the chasim. Okay, Gabalta, we will stop here, and Be'ez Hashem, we will be mamshach tomorrow. What should we name today's shir?